This is Danielle again. I am back with part 3 of my video series for Module 2 readings, this time with Chapter 7, using adjectives and adverbs to describe. So the first two readings in this module, the first one about independent clauses and dependent clauses, and Chapter 5 on run-ons and comma splices, we're really focusing on getting you into learning some of those basic building blocks of how to craft grammatically correct full thoughts, right? Sentences. And now the book is there, this chapter, and the readings are taking you into a direction of how do we use parts of speech to kind of spice up or add description and variety to those independent clauses and dependent clauses correctly. So this chapter obviously focuses on the parts of speech, adjectives and adverbs. And just as a side note, there are arguably, this isn't, sometimes people say there are 8 parts of speech or 10 parts of speech, but it's usually agreed upon that there are 9 parts of speech: the verb, noun, adjective, determiner, adverb, pronoun, preposition, conjunction, and interjection. And I highlighted in green what I've already talked about in the previous 2 videos. The subject is what I talked about in terms of the noun and the pronoun. And the yellow is what we're talking about in this video, the adjective and the adverb. So I'm going to just kind of dive right in. And again, I've taken some 2 pictures from the textbook. So I'm going to get into adjectives. So there's two particular pages that I thought worked well. One is on using adjectives correctly, and the other is on using adverbs correctly. And so they give you just a nice overview of how to use them correctly, and then I have some additional information on that, and this just to show you. So, right, the first is that adjectives are placed in the front of the word they describe, and hopefully some of this sounds familiar. They can follow what's called a linking verb. Excuse me, which is expresses a state of being. So, right, seems or was. Was is the to be verb, so that expresses a state of being, obviously, to be. So, and then several adjectives, not all, can describe the same noun or pronoun. So, George's 3 biology assignments, the worn, ragged denim jackets. So, okay. So again, and I just kind of have here some information. Some of it is a repeat from what the textbook is giving us. So I thought I'd just kind of go through it. Again, like, what is an adjective? We always talk about an adjective as a word that describes, and that is what it is. It's a word that describes. But it can at times be more complicated than that, because it's also a word that modifies, and that means that it can also modify other parts of speech. So it can modify nouns, it can modify verbs. Usually it's modifying a verb, or it can modify like a pronoun or a noun, like I said. So, this is an example of the big dog was hungry. Big and hungry, they are working as adjectives to describe the situation. If you just said the dog was hungry, right, that would be the independent clause, but in here, big was added to give more description to what type of dog it is, right? We know it's not a small dog. So again, the adjective usually comes before a noun to describe that noun. You can say the green car. These are just some examples. Dark sky, interesting story. Sometimes it can come after a verb. So before a noun or after a verb, and that's kind of like what it was up here, right after that linking verb. Um, and you can see that all these verbs seemed, became, and is and became are both from the to be verb, and seemed, right? These are all linking verbs because they all demonstrate or are all verbs that are a state of being. So my car is green, the sky became dark, or his story seemed interesting. So those are all after green, dark, and interesting are all after linking verbs there. And what's important about to note here is that these sentences, the independent clauses, would not be complete but for the adjectives. So even though we have the subject, which is car, actually, if you think about the grammatical subject, I know we've got my here, a pronoun, and we have car, and we have is as the verb. If we just had my car is or car is, that's not an independent clause, right? So we need my car is what, right? My car is green. So we need that adjective to complete the thought, to make it a grammatically complete sentence. And then down here, so that's the descriptive part. This gets into modifying pronouns, right? So they were empty. Now this can work on its own, right? They were, because that's as an independent clause, subject and verb. But this empty provides additional information, additional descriptive information that could be useful for whatever context this would be in. I thought it seemed strange. And again, strange is coming after that linking verb. Were also comes from the to be verb. Also, are not is also a to be verb. So also note that these adjectives are also coming after linking verbs. And they're also used to modify pronouns. So those, the italicized words, it and they, those are all pronoun. So the expensive is referring to those. The strange is referring to it. And when I say referring, I mean it's modifying. It is strange. They is empty, and those are expensive. So it's modifying it, meaning it's giving it more information. And then our book also talks about how we can use two or more adjectives together. And this is also important because you have to know when to use commas between adjectives. Because there are times when if you're using multiple adjectives, it's important to know when you need to put a comma between them so your reader doesn't get confused. Right? But, a beautiful young French lady, it is black and white. Okay, so moving on, in terms of the form that it takes, this is called morphology. So what it actually looks like. So for example, like with adverbs, we always hear like, oh yeah, an adverb is a word that ends in ly, right? So with adjectives, like what do they look like? So some adjectives have particular endings. They're not always the same, right? Adjectives are kind of all over the board because there's so many descriptive words out there. But a lot, this is just trying to give some kind of list as to what they might be. But, this able or able ending, like washable or credible, ish or like, childish, childlike, fool or less, careful, careless, the OUS ending, dangerous, harmonious, and the Y ending, dirty or pretty. But this is very true that many adjectives have no obvious form. So it's just a matter of, is this word being used to describe? And because adjectives oftentimes also work with verbs, you can have, say, an adjectival verb. So it can get confusing to kind of, if you're trying to, if you've ever tried to diagram a sentence, which is a horrible experience, so I don't recommend it. But if you're ever trying to pick out, okay, where's my adjective and where's my verb and where's my determiner and my auxiliary or whatever it is, especially if you've ever taken another language, that can get really tricky sometimes because your adjective might be an adjectival verb, because it's tied to the verb. It's modifying the verb. So it's part of the verb. It's not the verb, but it's part of the predicate. It's part of the verb. Adverbs can also be comparative or superlative. So, right, if you ever have words like big, bigger, biggest, which goes back to like the big dog was hungry, good, better, best, or beautiful, more beautiful, or the most beautiful. So that's kind of adverbs and adjectives. And before I get down to adverbs, the one thing I want to say about adjectives and adverbs in writing, and this is just kind of a note, is that in writing, we don't want to overuse adverbs and adjectives. These are words that we can easily, that's an adverb, use as crutches when we don't know what else to say. Same thing with prepositions. Or we are looking to fill up space. So, using adjectives and adverbs in writing should be done so carefully and thoughtfully and with intention. So you don't just want to like throw in adverbs and adjectives, because there'll be times when it's like, is that really necessary? Did you have to say that? Or because then you can get into so overusing these, or using these in ways that are unnecessary can get you in the realm of wordy writing. And you don't want to fall into those realms. So that's important to know about adjectives and adverbs. It's good to know how to use them correctly and effectively, but it's also important to know that just like with every other part of speech, not with every other part of speech, but sort of. I mean, this goes along the lines more like with prepositions, kind of these filler words. There's times when we have to use prepositions, and there's most times we don't need to use prepositions. Same things with adjectives and adverbs. Like there's times when they're needed, and there's times when they're just not needed, when we can write much more concisely without them. And by using them, we're in fact hurting our writing, because we're just essentially writing fluff at that point by using too much descriptive language. And the writer or the reader, particularly in academic writing, can get bored pretty quickly, or get lost because there's so much description. So moving on to adverbs. This is the sorry for the bad picture, but this is the part I wanted to. Let me make this larger. This is the using adverbs correctly page from the textbook. And again, like I just said earlier, many adverbs end in ly. It's not unfortunately, as I said in my last video, there's always a but however, except for this, right? Some don't. Not all verbs do, right? Like often, now, always, and not, right? So to determine whether a word is an adverb, look at how it functions in your sentence. So in order to do that, you have to have an understanding of how parts of speech work. And I do have under my parts of speech, I have a little caveat that's really annoying, which is some words can be considered more than one part of speech depending on context and usage. So, for example, if you're looking at the word to, it could be operating as a verb or it could be operating as a preposition. So you just have to understand, based on how you have it written, is it operating as a verb or is it operating as a preposition? So that takes a knowledge of understanding how words work, and what each part of speech means, and kind of being able to pick out what they are. So that goes back to that diagramming. Like, don't diagram, because you'll hate sentences forever. Um, Not that you love them now, but it's I mean, they're doing nice diagramming in here. This is not the bad diagramming that I was taught as a child, but this is a nice way of just being like, okay, this I know is an adverb, this is the verb, this is a preposition, this is an object, this is a prepositional phrase, this is my subject. Like, I'm able to I'm able to pick it apart so I know what each part of the sentence is in terms of the parts of speech. And that's also important for what we call syntax. And Syntax is the order in which we put parts of speech in a sentence. So it's how we order our words when we're writing. So if I ever say, like, your syntax needs work, or syntactically, this is a little difficult to read, it means that you're ordering your sentences in a way where the parts of speech don't make sense. So if, like, the adverb is coming in a weird place, or the preposition or the prepositional phrase is in a weird place, or the verb is in a strange place, or it's just not working. So it that's another reason why understanding the parts of speech, and not even all the parts of speech, like I know there's those 9 parts of speech, and like, interjections are so minor, and I don't even think it's important to academic writing to know what they are. But like I said, we'll go through prepositions later. Determiners are fairly easy to go over, so we may eventually get to those. But we've already covered, like, major aspects of parts of speech, so you should be able to go in and identify what's what. And at this point, it'll get more difficult as you write more complex sentences and complex paragraphs. But always try to break it down into those: where are my coordinating conjunctions? Where are my independent clauses? And then go from there. So in this independent clause, I have this adjective, this adverb, this preposition, this verb, this whatever. So if you just break it down into smaller chunks, it's easier to dissect what you have when it comes to identifying those parts of speech. So in terms of adverbs, right, most end in ly, not all of them. Adverbs can, like adjectives, they modify verbs, adjectives, or other adverbs. So they do a lot of things. And just like I said above, you don't want to overuse adverbs, just like you don't want to overuse adjectives. And overusing adverbs is very easy to do, and I just did it with the word very. So, because the word very doesn't mean anything, so it's kind of empty, just like the word good. Like, if you want to try to define good for me, you won't be able to. If you want to define great, you won't be able to do that for me, because they have no meaning. So here, right, Clara patiently waited for the appointment. These are demonstrating adverbs describing verbs, right? And then it's reminding you that a verb expresses action or a state of being, because that's referring back to those, like, to be verbs, like is, are, was, becoming, were, depending on what tense you're in of the to be verb. There are a lot of them. But that ly adverb, right? And the thing about adverbs is they always this has become my anger towards adverbs in the last several years, is that they always come before the verb. It's because they modify the verb, so it drives me crazy when they don't come before the verb. So this, yeah, patiently waited. The fact that this is at the end is driving me crazy. The building crumbled quickly. I'm like, no, it doesn't go there. It should go before crumbled. The building quickly crumbled. So I don't like that. That's an example because I think it's a poor example of where an adverb should go. It's technically, I would say that's grammatically incorrect. Sorry, textbook. I am going to disagree with you at times. And then the winning team proudly watched. That's correct because the adverb is coming before the verb. So, and just to reiterate some of those things that the textbook told us, right? An adverb tells us more about a verb. That's important to know because that's where people can get in the bad habit of how much more do we need to know about a verb? Do we need to know more about a verb, or is the verb on its own enough to tell us the information? So that's where we can get into that wordy writing, those extra words that aren't necessary. So if it's really important for us to know that in whatever context Clara is waiting for her appointment, that she patiently waited, if it's important for us to know that she patiently waited, okay. If there were no reason for us to know that she was patiently waiting, depending on the context of where the sentence would be coming, I would say, why are you using the word patiently? Why can't it just say Clara waited for the appointment? Because that has meaning on its own. All patient, excuse me. All patiently does is tell us how she waited. So why is it that we need to know that she waited patiently? So those are the questions that come up when we use adverbs. Right, same thing with adjectives. It qualifies or modifies, but in this case, verbs. So the man quickly ran. I can't stand it when they come after the verb. That's just, in my opinion, flat out wrong. But right. So John speaks loudly is answering the question, how does John speak? Afterwards, this is a non-ly. She smoked a cigarette. Right. When did she smoke? Mary lives locally. Where does Mary live? Right. So those are answering questions. So, and this is the adverbs can also modify adjectives. This is where you're also going to have a hard time convincing. This is where it's very easy also to fall into wordiness. Because adverbs can modify adjectives and other adverbs. Tara is really beautiful. It works very well. So my question there would be, why is it that she's really beautiful? What does really beautiful mean versus just beautiful? And it works very well versus just it works well. What is the difference there? At the level of writing, what is the difference? So it especially very is a highly overused word. And the same thing with really. So you have to challenge yourself in terms of, why am I writing this or using this word, and is it necessary? Same thing, he is really handsome. I don't know what really handsome is versus just handsome. Like, how handsome is he? I would expect some type of metaphor versus he's really handsome. Okay, that doesn't give me additional information. because I don't know what your quantification of really handsome is versus just handsome. That was extremely kind of you. Again, I would say this is unnecessary because that was kind of you versus extremely kind. Again, in terms of quantifying or qualifying what extremely kind is versus just kind is really something that is specific to the writer. So if you give it to the reader, it's going to make different sense. So how do you communicate that information to the writer in a way where you're not like, just that's extremely kind? Because that may make sense to the reader or to the writer, but if you don't explain it in a way that's more specific and explicit, it's not going to convey any meaning to the reader. Modifying another adverb, right? So here we have two ly verbs. She drives incredibly slowly. I would say that's too wordy. I would just say she drives slow. I think this is too wordy. And then he drives fast. I don't think extremely is needed. So these are just this is just me trying to show not only what adjectives and adverbs are, but also trying to explain how adjectives and adverbs are overused in writing and how are oftentimes unnecessary and how oftentimes don't communicate the information with that you may think they're communicating to the reader, because your reader is, like I said, in the case of he is really handsome, that is going to mean one thing for you, but it's going to mean your reader's not going to know how to understand that because they don't know what your, like, how your qualification of that is based on their qualification. So that's everything I've got on chapter 7 for now. And I will be back soon with the final video for module 2 readings.